Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Yahara Lakes 101, our Science Cafe. I'm James Ty, Executive Director of Clean Lakes Alliance. Whether you like it or not, fall is here. Those leaves are coming down, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Raking the leaves is one of the best things you can do to help protect the lakes, getting them out of the streets, mulching them into your lawn, using them for your garden, but we'll hear more about that later. That phosphorus creates algae in lakes, and that is one of the best things that we work on a regular basis, is to figure out how to get less phosphorus into our lakes. Since the founding of the Clean Lakes Alliance 10 years ago, we have invested $1.1 million into projects to help protect the lakes. That's on top of our educational programming, our events, and different ways, our volunteerism, and our monitoring. One of the things that we're working on right now is called the Yahara Clean Compact. The Compact is bringing together 19 organizations to lay out our new plan to help protect the lakes. As we all know, climate change is here and we're getting a lot more rain than we did 10 years ago. So we're bringing everybody together to figure out how do we protect the lakes faster and quicker so we can all enjoy them. A few more announcements here. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors. First Weber Foundation, Johnson Financial Group, our host sponsor, the Edgewater, virtually now. Also support from National Guardian Life, our media partner, Isthmus, our production partners, Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, and also UW Extension Lakes Stevens Point. Going on to some of the other things is that right now, your donation is more important than ever. Feel free to go to Clean Lakes Alliance and make a small donation or large one to help support our efforts, such as this program here, our Yahara Lakes 101 Science Cafe. Now on to our presentation. Here is Amber Krogman of the Johnson Financial Group.
Thank you, James, and good morning, everyone. Welcome once again to Clean Lakes Alliance virtual Yahara Lakes 101 Lake Science Cafe. I am Amber Krogman, and I am one of the commercial insurance executives at Johnson Financial Group. JFG is proud to support Clean Lakes Alliance as a lake partner and as a sponsor of many of the Clean Lakes Alliance's events. In fact, I don't know if you were there, but we just wrapped up the fall golf event for which Johnson Financial Group was a platinum sponsor and provided its lovely volunteers, including yours truly. You might have seen me at the putting green. That event alone raised over $35,000 to help fund lake improvement projects, educational programs like the one you're attending, and volunteer lake monitoring equipment. I have a few more quick announcements. First, I do want to thank everybody who has renewed their friend or lake partner donations this year. Here is a list of lake partners who have just joined or renewed this past month. Johnson Financial Group is a proud lake partner, and we're hoping other businesses and organizations in the community will join us in supporting the Clean Lakes Alliance. Second, nominations for the Clean Lakes Alliance Community Awards are now open. If you or someone you know has done something great for the lakes, go ahead and nominate them by going to cleanlakesalliance.org/nominate. Back to today's talk, which is titled Leaf-Free Streets, Reducing Urban Phosphorus. Here to tell us a little bit more about the topic and to introduce our speaker is the very own Edgewater's Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, Amy Suppel. Amy?
Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be here with all of you. We miss hosting you at the Edgewater for Yahara Lakes 101 and other Clean Lakes Alliance community events. Being on the shore of Lake Mendota, the Edgewater is one of Clean Lakes Alliance's strongest supporters, and we are anxious to one day welcome you back to enjoy the lakefront in person. As Amber mentioned, today's talk is about leaf management, especially in urban areas. Did you all know that the storm sewers here in Madison lead directly to the lakes? Did you also know that when water passes through the leaves left in the gutter, it takes phosphorus with it right into the lakes? While trees are important to our community, today we are going to learn how we can manage leaves to help reduce phosphorus from entering our lakes. Speaking on the topic is Bill Selbig, a research hydrologist at the Upper Midwest Water Science Center of the U.S. Geological Survey. For the past 25 years, Bill's research has focused on pollutants in urban runoff, identifying their sources, and reaching how-to practices on how to treat them. In addition to his work at the USGS, Bill serves as a science advisor for several national stormwater research groups. As we listen to Bill's presentation, please feel free to use the question and answer function on the Zoom screen. We will be capturing all questions and we will address them at the end of today's talk. Please welcome Bill Selbig.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Keep this going. Okay, how are we doing?
Looks good, Bill.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the introduction and welcome everybody. And if you're like me, you looking out your window and you're seeing a lot of leaves falling down around you on this blustery fall day. So I think this talk is a little bit timely and maybe a good reminder at this time of year of how we can try to minimize the amount of phosphorus that is contained within the leaves from entering the stormwater runoff and eventually to our lakes. So before I get started, let me just draw your attention down to all of those logos down at the bottom. This project that I'm going to be talking to you about was a fairly comprehensive collaborative effort amongst many different agencies and organizations, including the Clean Lakes Alliance, but many governments, local cities, the League of Wisconsin Municipalities, which represents all of the regulated cities around the state of Wisconsin. And it's not contained within the state of Wisconsin. Obviously, other states that deal with leaf litter in the fall are also interested, including a lot of folks up in the New England states. So a great interest in this project and hopefully some really good information that can help reduce the amount of phosphorus that ends up in stormwater runoff. All right, so why are we worried about nutrients in stormwater? I would imagine that all of you, as just being part of this lecture, already have some knowledge about phosphorus and nitrogen and other nutrients in runoff that end up in our lakes. So why is it a big deal? Well, the photographs kind of clearly illustrate that. We're all familiar with the beach closures due to cyanobacteria and algae blooms in the summer. Not only does it represent loss of recreation, we can't, nobody wants to swim in that green muck. You don't want to get your boats in there. So there's a recreational loss, but there's also some health concerns that are attached with that. I think it wasn't all that long ago and it's still fresh in our memories, the city of Toledo had to shut down their water supply system because of a harmful algal bloom in Lake Erie. So, this has real repercussions as when we start over-fertilizing our water bodies, some serious implications for that. So we all have an interest in reducing the amount of phosphorus and other nutrients that end up in our lakes. But beyond just our own personal interest, a lot of the cities that drain, as was mentioned earlier, the storm sewer system does drain to these receiving water bodies, and a lot of these cities are regulated, and they have a certain amount that they have to meet. There are certain permit requirements that they can only contribute a certain amount. So we call this a total maximum daily load. And there is a total maximum daily load for phosphorus for not only the city of Madison, but a lot of the surrounding communities as well. So they're trying to figure out, well, how can we meet this requirement? And not that long ago, this is back in 2013, former Mayor Dave Cheslevich penned an article in the Isthmus that asked the question, can we save our lakes? And the question remains, can we save our lakes? So it's not for a lack of trying. In fact, if you do a very simple Google search of the most studied lake in the world, the first few hits from Google shows Lake Mendota is in fact the most studied lake in the world. And there are hundreds and hundreds of academic research articles on the condition of Lake Mendota. So we have been studying, can we save our lakes, for many, many years. But I think what's interesting is over the last decade or so, we've sort of coalesced around this idea of a common enemy, and that would be nutrients. And so rather than just having a diversified portfolio of what we might be interested for a particular lake or particular concern, a lot of organizations and folks around the lake, Yahara Lakes, the Lake Mendota watershed, have focused their efforts on phosphorus to try to minimize those beach closures and the algal blooms that I showed you about earlier. And so we try to identify, well, okay, well, where are these sources coming from? And the obvious ones are basically twofold. You can have either agricultural sources or urban sources. And so modeling that was done back in 2000 by the DNR and others showed that for Lake Mendota, the majority of the phosphorus is coming from agricultural sources. And if you look at that map, it's very clear why. A good chunk of that watershed or that drainage area for Lake Mendota is agriculture. But for Lake Monona, if you take a look in the center there, there's not that much agriculture at all. And the majority of the drainage area is in fact urban. A lot of it, what Lake Monona gets is from Lake Mendota, because the chain of lakes continues on south. But if you look at the boundary of the lake itself, it's mostly urbanized. So we cannot ignore the urban component of nutrient contributions to our lakes. And in fact, the urban sources are only going to continue to increase because, as we all know, with rapid urbanization, that conversion of agricultural land use is going to be turned into an urban land use. And to kind of illustrate that a little bit further, I came across some information from USDA that took a look at the major uses of land use in the United States going back to 1959 through 2012. And that chart on the left shows you, in terms of the million acres of the United States, really only urban land use is steadily increasing, whereas the others are steadily decreasing for the most part. The special uses, the black line that you're looking at, really could be considered urban as well, since that includes utilities and transportation and things that are associated with urban areas. So although it's not making up the largest portion of land use in the United States, it's steadily increasing. And if we look over the chart on the right, now I'm zooming into the Great Lakes states, and you can see how very rapidly we are seeing that the number of millions of acres of populated areas with greater than 2,500 people is increasing exceptionally. The interesting thing here is, for whatever reason, the state of Minnesota, that dark blue line, took a bit of a dip in the late 90s, and it was unclear to me why, but I gave this presentation to some other folks, and someone from the audience shouted out that was when Jesse Ventura was the governor. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I thought that was kind of interesting. But nonetheless, the urban source of phosphorus is going to only steadily increase. So we should be very interested in how to mitigate that source. So what are they? What are the sources of phosphorus in an urban area? Well, they're multiple. They come from a number of different areas and sources, including automotive detergents. There are detergents in your vehicle, lubrication, oils, grease. They all contain some element of phosphorus, which of course, not every car is leak proof. We leak onto the roads and on it goes into the storm sewers. Lawn runoff, our grassed, manicured lawns are a source of phosphorus just from the nature of the organic material. Now, fortunately for Dane County, we had a phosphorus ban in residential fertilizers that was in the late 2000s or mid 2000s. So we don't have to worry about that as a source, but nonetheless, those grass clippings do end up into the gutter. Pet waste is another one. Hopefully most of you folks who are walking your dogs are picking up the pet waste. But the pet waste that ends up on the lawn may not contribute a whole lot of phosphorus to a runoff, but nonetheless, folks who are dog walkers pick up those piles. Organic detritus, leaf litter primarily, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about for the rest of the morning here. And then just to complete that circle, we have atmospheric deposition. There's dust particles floating around in the air, and every time it rains, a lot of that phosphorus from the airborne phosphorus ends up on our land surfaces. Soil erosion can be a big one. Phosphorus is just contained within the soil in general, and anytime you have a construction project that opens up and exposes the soil with, and every time it rains, you have erosion of that transport of those particles into the storm sewer. And de-icers, that one was kind of new to me when I discovered that, but road salt application in the wintertime, there's phosphorus contained in that material as well. So there's multiple sources from urban landscape that we need to be considerate of. And I'm going to focus mostly on leaf litter. Back in 2012, the Yahara Clean developed a strategic action. It really took a focused effort from numerous people had a part in this, this product, this paper, to try to really figure out, oh, how are we going to address this on a watershed scale? And from that document came several actions, initiatives, if you will, that were broken down into either a rural action or an urban action. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the majority of that effort was focused on agricultural sources, which they should be, since that's the primary player here. But you can see almost 30% of that pie is dedicated to urban actions. What is it that we can do within the urban landscape to mitigate phosphorus? One of the ones, the idea that sort of rose to the surface, sort of a biggest bang for your buck approach, I suppose, was leaf collection. This is something that a lot of municipalities do already. And the thought was, it's primarily done as sort of a convenience for residents. But the thought was, well, by removing the leaf litter in the fall, are you thereby removing a bunch of phosphorus from runoff as well? And if so, is there ways that you can somehow modify that leaf collection program to optimize the reduction of phosphorus? What we want to avoid is what you see down in the lower right is this leaf tea. That, by the way, is one of our actual water quality samples collected from one of our monitoring sites in the fall. And you can see it looks like a nice home brewed tea, but that tea color is just loaded with phosphorus. That's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent that runoff from entering the storm sewer. So that was sort of the genesis of our research project. And the objectives of the study were really twofold. The first objective was to use the paired basin statistical design to really determine if removing leaf litter would result in any detectable change in phosphorus load reduction in the storm sewer at all. If you remove it, can we detect it? Because if the answer to that question was no, then there really wasn't, it was basically a case closed. We don't need to go any further. But if the answer to that was yes, then we can start stepping into actual municipal leaf collection and street cleaning programs to determine which are better than others and how you might be able to optimize that. So I'm going to walk you through the results of that study right now. So the first objective really was to characterize, well, okay, well, what does the phosphorus concentration look like from a typical medium density residential area with what I would consider to be a medium to high overhead tree canopy. And what we're looking at here is the average phosphorus concentration in each month of the year, winter excluded in this case, for 2 of our study catchments. Now, in this scenario, there was no leaf collection at all. There was no management program. Leaves that fell on the street stayed on the street. But what you can clearly see, and I provided some photographic evidence for you at the top for reference, is that leaves have a very pronounced effect on the phosphorus concentration. In April, relatively low amounts, but as you can see from the photo, there's not a lot of leaves on the trees yet. Our streets are relatively clean. In May, we see a little bit of a bump in concentration, but that makes sense because now we have pollen, we have the emergence of seeds, and there's a little bit of organic residue on the gutter line, and as a response, we see an increase in phosphorus. But from June all the way through September, we have full leaf maturation. The only sources of phosphorus that we see are from those others that I described earlier, and they're relatively constant. But in October, obviously now at this time of year, we have all that leaf litter that falls into the gutter, and we see this massive response in phosphorus concentration. And even in November, it's still quite elevated, but a little bit less than October, because now we don't have any new sources of leaves. Most of the leaves are down, but yet they still remain in the gutter, so they are still leaching a bit of phosphorus until they're completely removed. So what we wanted to do as a first attempt was to say, okay, if we go out there and just remove all that vegetation from the street, can we see any reduction in phosphorus at all in the storm sewer? So our field crews were out there with leaf blowers, cleaning the streets from all leaves and organic detritus right before a storm, or as close to a storm, predicted storm as possible. And that was going to be our maximum effort. And here are the results of that effort. Now we're looking at that same chart I just showed you, except I plotted the new response in that red dashed line from removing all of the vegetation off the street right before storm. And very clearly you can see we basically have a flat line where April through September is very similar to what we saw in the past, but we would expect that because we don't have any leaf litter during that period of time. In October and November, you can now see we've maintained near summertime levels of phosphorus concentrations than before. So clearly that was an indication that phosphorus is a major contributor, or I'm sorry, leaves are a major contributor of phosphorus in the fall. The other interesting thing that came from that particular portion of the study was the distribution, the seasonal contribution on an annual sense of leaves in the fall. So we're looking now at two things, and I'll walk you through it. That chart on the left shows you the difference both in terms of the magnitude of the phosphorus yield, or the kilograms per hectare, from our control catchment, where we had absolutely no leaf collection done at all. The leaves that fell on the street stayed on the street, versus our test catchment, where we had complete removal of the leaves. And clearly you can see the magnitude is very different, but also the seasonal distribution represented by the colors. And I'll just draw your attention to fall in this case, the green shaded portion of those bars. And in the control catchment, where no leaf collection was done, fall dominates that portion of the column. And if we look at the pies on the right, that represented 56% of the annual phosphorus yield in that particular area. So the majority of the phosphorus over the entire year in that particular area came in the fall. Whereas in our test catchment, it completely flip-flopped. It's now the smallest contributor on an annual sense. And the other thing I'll draw your attention to, and hopefully you can see my pointer here, is that in the fall, that 56% came from only 8 storms, whereas in the summer you have 3 times the number of storms, and in spring twice the number of storms, but yet producing less phosphorus yield than in the fall with only 8 storms. What that tells us is that the concentration is so much higher in the fall from leaf litter of phosphorus. It's so much higher in leaf litter in the fall than in the spring or the summer, that it doesn't take that many storms to produce a very large load that ends up in the lakes. So it's really incumbent on us to remove that source before it enters the storm sewer. Now the question then became, well, how representative was 2015 when this data was produced? We showed 56% came from leaf litter in the fall for that one particular catchment in that one particular year. But how typical is 2015? Well, the way we addressed that was we ran a 20-year simulation, taking actual measured concentrations that, from seasonal spring, summer, and fall, plugged it into this model and ran it over 20 years of different types of rainfall. And the result is, as you might expect, it doesn't always rain the same amount every year. In the years that it rains less, you would get less phosphorus. In years it rains more, you're going to get more phosphorus. But on an average scale, it ends up being a bit more than we considered. So over a 20-year span, fall ended up being 43% of the annual yield. Not 56, not quite as high as 56, but still a fairly significant number and much higher than summer or spring. So fall, again, is very, very important. So our first objective was satisfied. Now it's time for us to move on and evaluate actual municipal leaf collection and street cleaning programs. And I put this, this icon up there just to kind of give you a frame of reference. As this bookend approach, where on one side of the bookend, we have all leaves stay on the streets, there's do nothing. And then the opposite side of that bookend is all leaves are gone, you do everything. And the books in between would be different types of municipal programs. And our goal was to try to quantify that. Our study was located in 3 different cities in the state of Wisconsin. Most of it was done here in Madison, but we also evaluated up in the city of Fond du Lac and in Oshkosh. And our typical study catchment looked like the graphic on the right is a medium density residential area with single family homes predominantly and a variety of overhead tree canopy. The tree canopy ranged of the 9 catchments that we monitored from 4% all the way up to 67%. And this is just street trees that we're talking about, not the trees in the backyard. These are just the street trees and the canopy that is over the street. So quite a considerable range. And the diversity of tree species came down to approximately 4 or 5 species of trees that were the major players here. And that's fairly typical for most cities in the entire state. Maybe an exception could be up in the northern part of the state, but around here in the southern and the central part of the state, it's mostly maples and ash trees, and an occasional honey locust and a few other species. As a side note, the ash trees, the green ash trees are, as you might know, subject to infestation from the emerald ash borer. So a lot of these green ash trees that line our city streets are in the process of being removed, and there's careful consideration being done as to what should replace them. One of the options is to replace them with a tree that may have a low phosphorus content in its leaves. But as you can see, that the diversity of species varied for all of our catchments. In terms of what types of management practices we evaluated, it really came down to the 3 bullets that you're looking at on the upper right. It was a variation in the way you collect the leaves. And that came down to the 2 primary methods, which was, if you're from Madison, this is probably what you're going to see out in your front yard is some sort of modified vehicle with pushing all those leaf piles into the street and then into a garbage truck to be hauled away. Or in some cases, you may have a vacuum mulching system. I live in Monona, and here we use, that the city uses a vacuum mulching system mounted to a truck, and it just drives by and sucks up all the leaf piles. And then that would be followed by some sort of street cleaner, whether it's a high efficiency street cleaner using a regenerative air system, or the tried and true mechanical broom, which is what the majority of cities use around the state. And then finally, the frequency of both of those. And in our case, we evaluated either a weekly frequency or what I am coining a bi-weekly frequency, which would be approximately every other week, and ended up being around 3 to 4 times per season. And here are the results of that evaluation. Now, the first chart you're looking at represents a no leaf collection scenario. So this is the concentration of phosphorus, the average concentration of phosphorus in the catchments that we evaluated without any leaf collection at all. And that black line represents the percentage of overhead street tree canopy. And really the only thing I want you to take away from this particular chart is the real nice correlation we see with increasing street tree canopy. We see increasing average phosphorus concentrations in stormwater. As you might expect, there's more leaf litter, therefore you would see more phosphorus. However, there is a little bit of an anomaly in this chart, in the trend, where you can see for the M4 catchment, we have a dip, and there's fairly low tree canopy but yet had a high response in phosphorus concentration. So I'm going to zoom in on those 3 catchments now and do a little bit of a deeper dive into what's going on. And the first thing that I noticed when I take a look at those 3 catchments is the distribution of tree species is not exactly the same. They have relatively similar amounts of maple, but if you'll notice the M4 catchment in the middle has about 25% of that pie dedicated to honey locust, whereas the other 2 catchments have little to no honey locust at all. And if we take a look into the literature and we find what the phosphorus content of honey locust is, it's second only to green ash. So here we have a species of tree that has a very high phosphorus concentration in its leaf litter that is primarily found in the M4 catchment, but not in the others. So even though we don't have as much tree canopy, the canopy that is there is honey locust. A good chunk of it is honey locust, which has a very high phosphorus content. Therefore, we don't necessarily need as much canopy to produce the same amount of phosphorus concentration we see in the other catchments. So this is one of the underlying messages here is that yes, canopy is important, but but we don't want to forget about the species. Okay, moving on. The other thing that came out of this study that is very important in terms of management is that the most of the phosphorus that we're measuring in stormwater is in the dissolved phase. So if we break down phosphorus, you have total phosphorus, which represents both dissolved and particulate fractions. That particulate fraction is the phosphorus bound to a sediment particle. That's relatively easy to manage. You just capture that sediment particle through settling in some sort of wet detention pond or something like that, and you remove that portion. But the dissolved fraction is very difficult to remove. It does not get captured in a wet detention pond or other type of best management practice. Typically, you need a little bit more involved process like filtration, which can be more expensive to remove that fraction. However, if you remove the source, i.e. removing it through leaf collection and street cleaning, you've thereby removed that dissolved fraction as well. So removing dissolved phosphorus through leaf collection could be a very viable and relatively low cost way for treatment. Okay, so this is sort of the take-home slide of our study. This is the looking at the % reduction in phosphorus through various types of municipal leaf collection and street cleaning programs. And it's a bit of a busy slide here, and I don't expect you to digest everything. But really all I want you to take away is, again, if we take a look at the bars indicate the % reduction in total phosphorus over different types of management practices. The management practices of this sort of weird nomenclature down here, and I will summarize it in the next slide. But really, what I want you to look at from this particular slide is, again, that relationship between tree canopy, represented by the black line, and % phosphorus reduction. Really, this can just be boiled down to the more leaf litter you have on the streets, the easier it is to remove that leaf litter, and therefore you're going to get a larger % reduction. And the rest is just how often you're out there doing it, the frequency, and the method of which you're collecting the leaves and cleaning the streets. And if I'll just summarize it with this slide here, because this is really what it comes down to. And real quick, a bit of explanation. Those black circles with the number represent the frequency of either leaf collection or street cleaning. So if you see a 1, that means that that was done every week. If you see a 2, that means it was done every other week. So our top performer, as you might expect, is when you use the vacuum mulching system with a high efficiency street cleaner, a regenerative air cleaner in this case, and that was done every single week. We saw a 70% reduction in total phosphorus in that scenario. If you step down a little bit, where now you don't collect the leaves every week, you collect them every other week, so less of a leaf collection frequency, but yet you maintain that high efficiency street cleaning every single week, you get 60% reduction. So still fairly sizable, though not quite 70%. And then stepping down even further, now you just do what we would consider the Madison standard operating procedure. This is what the city of Madison does right now, where you collect the leaves using this transfer system, and then you sweep the streets using a mechanical broom every other week, or approximately 3 to 4 times per season. You'll get a 40% reduction. So overall, the conclusions are that yes, leaf litter is a significant source of phosphorus in stormwater runoff, and that using a high efficiency street cleaner and an effective way of removing the leaf piles can result in 60% or more phosphorus reduction to stormwater runoff. What's interesting is, and I didn't get into the details of this due to time, but it turns out that the way in which we collect the leaf piles on the terrace is really not so as important as how the streets are cleaned and how frequent those streets are cleaned. This whole presentation can be summarized by the simple statement that phosphorus reduction is simply a component of how clean those streets are before a storm event. The cleaner they're going to be, the leaf-free streets, if you will have a very low phosphorus contribution versus the streets that you see pounds and pounds of leaves collected in the gutter are going to have a high phosphorus contribution. So cleaning the streets is of utmost importance in this case. For management considerations, we should think not only of the tree canopy, but also the species as well. And that really kind of comes into play when we start removing green ash trees and considering what is it that we want to replace them with. So I'll leave you with this last slide as what is it that we as homeowners can do, or as residents of our city can do to help prevent that amount of phosphorus from entering Lakes Mendota, Monona, and so on. And first, I think the easiest way to do it is just to rake those leaves out of the street. You're already raking the leaves onto the terrace. Just take a little bit extra time and rake the leaves out of the gutter and onto the terrace. And you'll do it will go miles to help prevent the amount of phosphorus from leaching out of those leaves and entering directly into the storm sewer. The leaves that you rake out of your backyard, well, you could leave them in the backyard. You can compost them and use them as a good source of fertilizer, or create a mulch for your existing backyards. Bagging the leaves, I think, would be better than piling them onto the terrace. We didn't analyze how well bagging leaves, we didn't quantify how that reduces phosphorus, but by just containing them and preventing any sort of runoff, I think would go a long way. And finally, just keeping those storm inlets free of debris. That photograph kind of shows you what happens in the fall, where we get these leaf dams that will clog drains. And this can actually be a hazard because it will prevent water from entering those drains and cause localized flooding issues. So it's always a good idea to keep them free. There's adopt a storm drain programs. I know there is in Monona, and I'm sure there's in Madison, so you could adopt a storm drain and keep it free of leaves. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Luke?
All right, thank you so much for that great presentation, Bill. And I just want to remind everyone who's following along that you can send your questions in via the Q&A feature on Zoom. So we're going to get to as many of the questions that you put up there as we can as time allows. We do have a question about why is there not any monitoring during the winter time? This person goes on to say, I understand that some of the largest nutrient flashes in agriculture occur in February and March from random snow melt.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for us, it was more of a pragmatic issue. Monitoring urban runoff in the wintertime is extremely difficult. As you can imagine, it's cold, our sample lines freeze. It takes a considerable amount of electricity to keep any sort of thawing effect on our sample lines. So it was more of a balancing in terms of how much our budget we have and resources. We didn't consider winter monitoring. Now that said, there has been some research out of the University of Minnesota that has looked at contributions of phosphorus in the wintertime. And as you might expect, I think it is worthwhile. It ends up being larger than we originally thought, and simply because the leaves that end up in the street in the fall that never got collected are still there in the winter. And so they may end up getting covered with snow, and in the springtime when that snow melts, it's very similar to what you might find in an agricultural sense, where now snow melt percolates through leaf piles and contributes that leachable phosphorus into snow melt runoff. So I believe that if we were to continue to do this in the future, I would make every effort to include winter monitoring.
Okay, the next question is, when discussing the total phosphorus load from streets in your test, is there a way to also understand the amount of precipitation?
The amount of phosphorus contributed from precipitation, I'm wondering. I think that might be what the question is.
They do say they suspect more precipitation would equal more runoff compared to this fall, which has been dry, so that we may see less.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. And I mentioned earlier, the more frequent rainstorms we get, the more precipitation depth will only translate into greater volume, runoff volume, and we'll, as you correctly assume, we're going to have a higher phosphorus load as a result of that storm. The interesting thing, I didn't get into any of this at all, but we also tracked we measured the amount of leaf mass on our study streets on a weekly basis, and we correlated that to the amount of phosphorus we measured in the end of the pipe. If I were to show you a graph, it would be a fairly linear line, or a linear correlation, where the more leaves you have on the street, the more pounds of leaves you have on the street, the more phosphorus you'll see at the end of the pipe. And if you have very few rain events in the fall, those leaves contribute nothing. They're dry, and they just remain on the street. The more frequent rain events you have, the more opportunity you have for phosphorus to be leached out of those leaves, and subsequently the greater amount of phosphorus that ends up in the lake.
Okay, our next question. Your study looked at mostly medium to high tree canopied streets, so pretty much the worst case scenario. What percentage of the urban Madison land use is comprised of these types of streets?
Oh, that's a good question. And if I had some folks from city engineering on the call, and maybe they are on the call, they would know that answer. I don't. I'm guessing, and this is this is not an exact number, but I've heard the number 60% thrown around there on occasion. So it's, I don't want to say that that's what it is, because I honestly don't know. But you're correct in that not every part of the city is going to be a concern. If we have, the new residential areas that have these tiny trees that are still very young, there's not going to be a significant amount of leaf litter, and therefore there won't be a significant amount of phosphorus from that leaf litter. So those are going to be a low priority for the city. In terms of management, they're going to focus their efforts on these old residential areas with mature trees, a high overhead tree canopy. What that magic number percent tree canopy is, we're still trying to figure out. I would say it's somewhere between 30%, 35, 40% tree canopy, where anything less than 30% tree canopy, it starts to become an issue where we just can't detect any change from management efforts. It doesn't mean that leaf collection will go away. I believe they'll still do it, but in terms of how it gets applied towards a phosphorus credit in the eyes of the DNR, I don't know if those areas will be considered.
Okay, has anybody ever looked at how mulching leaves makes a difference in the phosphorus load compared to removal or no management?
Well, mulching of leaves, I would assume, would be something that you would do and distribute it on your existing lawn. I'm trying to think of how mulching, well, let me put it this way. Mulching leaves, you're basically shredding them and making larger leaves into smaller bits of leaves. And what we do know is that just through vehicle traffic, that is kind of like a way to mulch leaves on the street surface themselves. And so what you're doing is you're grinding up a larger leaf into a smaller bit, which exposes more surface area. It exposes more opportunity for phosphorus to be released. So that's something we want to avoid. If you're going to mulch leaves, that's fine. I think if you keep them on your yard, you put them in the backyard, that's great. It's a good source of phosphorus for it, make a nice healthy lawn in the spring. Just keep it out of the street. Just that is the bottom line message, is to do everything you can to keep leaves out of the street.
When someone is looking at replacing green ash trees, do you have a species you suggest?
I don't, but I will. There has been some research done back in the 80s by John Dorney, who actually looked at different types of tree species here in Madison and in Milwaukee. And so there is a range of, this is all laboratory experimentation, but there is a range of phosphorus from a low end to a high end. But typically what we see here in Wisconsin in our street trees is on the high end. But we are working with some folks from the U.S. Forest Service who have an interest in that sort of information, because a lot of cities use a model called iTree to help them plan what are the effects of tree on not only a runoff sense, how much a volumetric sense of how trees can prevent stormwater volume from entering the storm drains, but also a water quality sense as to how can trees benefit the water quality of storm sewer runoff in the first place. So species plays a big role in that, and we're hoping to work with them to help develop that database. As a tangent to all of this, the University of Wisconsin has been doing some experimentation to do just that. And the number of tree species that they looked at was limited to only 2. It was maple and ash. But what it did is a little bit more in-depth analysis to how long does it take for that phosphorus to leach out of that leaf over a period of time. Does it matter if it's a new leaf or an old leaf? Does it matter if it's intact or shredded? So there's a lot of considerations and variables that are going into this sort of research. And ultimately our goal is to take all this information and plug it into some sort of model that can be useful to municipalities. We don't have to go through this detailed research effort. It can be something that you click a few buttons in a model and you develop your own management program, and it will predict what sort of phosphorus reduction you would expect from that program.
And we have a question that touches on exactly what you were just talking about. They're asking, when does the biggest pulse of the dissolved phosphorus get released once leaves are in the street? Is it after the first rain, or after the leaves started to decay, or after they get broken up by car traffic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there is a paper that has been published that goes into that in probably way more detail than you care. But the bottom line for that is the new leaves that fall have the highest phosphorus content available, and that the very next storm that hits those leaves is going to release the largest pulse of phosphorus. And if for the statistically inclined folks in the audience, if you can imagine an exponential first order decay function, that's basically what it looks like, where you have a very rapid release of phosphorus in a short amount of time that gradually decreases with increasing time, to the point where all of that phosphorus is leached out and there's none more available. And that usually occurs around 48 hours or so. So it's a fair amount of time that it has to be submerged in water to release all of its phosphorus. Typically a storm around here is only a few hours long, but within that few hours time, that's when the majority of the phosphorus is released. So those old leaves that are sitting around in the gutter, they're still contributing phosphorus, just not as much as the new leaves that are falling.
Okay, I have a question here wondering if you know of any grants or any funding available for local residents to help out with bagging supplies. In some areas, cities will give you a bag or two, but the compostable or reusable bags can be pretty expensive. So do you know anything about a grant opportunity for your homeowners?
I am not aware of any specific grants, but I would consult with, well, I'm trying to think. I would consult first with your city engineering department, and they might be a first stop. I know there are some groups that went through that effort, but it was more from a research perspective where they were trying to understand the effect of bagging, and the bags were provided to residents. But again, I think that was just part of a project that already had funding to do that. So unfortunately, no, I don't have a good list, but maybe some folks from the Clean Lakes Alliance might have that information.
Let's see here. Here's a question. Can you discuss opportunities for capturing soluble phosphorus at storm sewer outfalls?
Not a lot of opportunity. Once it reaches the outfall, it's pretty much on its way into a stream or lake. There are proprietary devices that you can retrofit a storm sewer. They're usually quite costly, and they vary from something as simple as just putting nets, large nets at the end of a pipe to capture what we call gross solids. In this case, it would be whole leaves, but they're primarily designed to capture trash. That would be one way of capturing leaves and preventing them from getting into a water body. But by that time, the damage is already done. That soluble phosphorus is already on its way. The only way that you can capture soluble phosphorus is twofold. One is infiltration, just removing the volume of water and putting it into the ground. Filtration, I guess 3 ways. Filtration, where you would have some expensive media that you would have the water percolate through and remove that dissolved phosphorus, but there really isn't any way you can have a filtration system large enough to handle stormwater, particularly from a large drainage area. So that's not very practical. I think the most practical and least costly is source control, just removing that source of phosphorus before it has an opportunity to get into stormwater runoff. And that's done through leaf collection and street cleaning.
Next question. Are all these studies in which you base your numbers from leaf collection on streets with curb and gutter with storm sewers? And would it make a difference in the numbers, in your opinion, if the roads have grass swales rather than curb and gutter with storm sewers?
That's a good question. And I have been asked something similar to that question in the past, where a lot of cities don't have curb and gutter. They have just a simple grassed area, not even a vegetated swale. But the bottom line here is the street is the major conveyance of runoff to a storm drain. Whatever you can do to keep that street clean is really going to go a long way in preventing phosphorus from getting into a stream or lake. A vegetated swale will help, but the intent of a vegetated swale is not for water quality. It's primarily for volume reduction, and it also serves as a conveyance mechanism. And there is some research out there that shows that vegetated swales can actually be a source of phosphorus and not necessarily reduce it because it's vegetated. And therefore you have more organic material that will contribute as you linearly move down the swale. I can't put any numbers to that. I don't have any data to support, but that is my suspicion, is that if you just put leaves into the vegetated swale, it's still serving as a conveyance system by which water will percolate through those leaves and eventually export into whatever the swale drains into.
Are Madison and Monona going away from honey locust as street trees?
I don't know the answer to that, but it's personally speaking, honey locust is one of the first trees to drop their leaves in the fall. And if you see these tiny little yellow leaves, like leaf petals, that accumulate probably the first, one of the first anyway. And as I showed you earlier, they're fairly high in phosphorus. So these are, whether the city will take that information and decide that honey locust is no longer in the future of street trees for Madison, I'm not sure. But I do think it has to be part of the conversation when we start selecting either through new development or removal of ash trees and replacement with something new, whether honey locust will be that tree. I do know it's not just a matter of phosphorus. there's a number of variables that have to be considered when you think about what sort of street trees you're going to use. You want to maintain healthy ecosystems, diversification for not only habitat, different types of animals, but also you want a good, healthy canopy to prevent, for canopy interception, to prevent throughfall and limit the amount of water that actually reaches the street. Shading, a heat island effect. There's a number of different, well, put it this way, trees are beneficial in so many ways that I think they sort of overshadow, those benefits overshadow the downfall from phosphorus contributions. But it should be part of the conversation, or let's put it this way, it can be part of the conversation to provide all those great benefits while also reducing the amount of phosphorus by what's contained within the leaf itself.
Okay, we've got two questions, two separate people, but in a way they kind of go together. Can you talk about maybe other species of trees that are low in phosphorus? And then we've got a question wondering about how ginkgo trees stack up.
Unfortunately, I don't have the, I can refer you to a paper that talks exactly about that. The author is John Dorney, D-O-R-N-E-Y. It was written in 1986, I believe. And I believe the title of the paper is Phosphorus Concentration in Leaves, something very simple like that. But if you do a simple Google search, it will come up. There he provides a laboratory analysis of different types of phosphorus content for various species found in the Midwest, but in Wisconsin. It's a few decades old. My hope is to go back and sort of replicate that for the dominant species we find in Wisconsin and use that information for our managers to make informed decisions as to what they would like to see on our streets. But unfortunately, I don't have a specific answer for the person who asked the question.
Okay, how does the phosphorus flowing into the lakes eliminated through leaf management practices compare to the phosphorus flowing into the lake from agriculture in the northern part of the Yahara Lakes watershed?
That's another really, really good question. And I'm hoping that there will be future analysis. It will probably have to be through model simulations. We have some excellent research that's been going on for several years and still going on that is documenting the amount of phosphorus that primarily is coming from agricultural sources into Lakes Mendota and Monona and others. So we do have statistically quantifiable information about that, but I think once we want to roll it all together from a watershed scale, it's going to require some modeling. And we have some excellent modelers who can do that. And the really neat thing is that we're still learning a heck of a lot here. And the information that we're gathering and learning can be used in these models. So we have the most recent up-to-date data sets, and our model simulations are going to be better than they've ever been before. What it means for urban versus agricultural, I'm not sure. My guess is that if we were to compare it back to the early 2000 modeling that was done back in the early 2000s, our proportions might shift a little bit. So rather than 75% coming from agriculture versus 25% in urban into Lake Mendota, maybe that's going to shift a little bit. Maybe now, 20 years later, it's going to be 60-40. I don't know what the exact proportion is, but my guess is it's going to change a little bit, where urban might be more important than it was previously.
Okay, we've got about another minute left. Here's one more question, if you can answer it in a minute. Do you think that cleaning up leaves 3 to 4 times each fall is practical from a labor standpoint? And if not, do you think the cities need to put more resources into their street departments during the fall season to make this practical?
Yeah, this comes down to, well, the great thing about living in the city of Madison and this area in general is that our engineering department is fantastic. They really are progressive when it comes to management and keeping our lakes as clean as possible, or doing everything they can to minimize the amount of nutrients entering the lake. So if they wanted to know what our existing program, their existing program looks like. How much phosphorus are we doing from what we do now? And based on that information, they realized that, okay, well, we just need to maybe increase our frequency up a little bit, and we're going to get quite a bit more reduction. And so I believe they are willing to do that, and they're looking into what it's going to take to meet that. But not only is it just from environmental perspective of doing the right thing, they're also going to get a larger credit from the state towards their permit requirement. And what that translates for the city of Madison and other communities is money. They're going to save money by modifying their leaf collection program to get a greater reduction in phosphorus than if they were to then have to, let's say, build some sort of expensive treatment device on to get that similar reduction elsewhere. It's very costly to remove phosphorus, and the way that the cities evaluate this is on a cost per pound of phosphorus. So how many dollars per pound of phosphorus reduced is it going to cost me? And they, of course, want to achieve the one that has the greatest amount of reduction, but at the lowest cost. This is, leaf collection could quite possibly be one of the lowest cost options for them. But the actual decisions as to what their management practices are going to look like in the end, at the end of the day, is going to be a discussion within the city of Madison and others.
All right, thank you so much, Bill, for your informative presentation and also your thoughtful responses as well. We did have a few problems with our link at the beginning, so I just want to remind people that we do always post these on our Facebook page and on our website as well. So if you missed a part of the presentation, you can catch up with that later today. But I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this month's Yahara Lakes 101 Science Cafe. You can join us next month. We're going to be here on Wednesday, November 11th to hear about the Yahara River Estuary Long-Term Plan. And just a reminder, if you have not become a friend of Clean Lakes yet in 2020, we want to remind you that you still have that opportunity to ensure that we continue to have educational programming like this in the future. We also want to encourage you to take our leaf challenge, rake those leaves out of the street, and send us a photo of that taking place in your neighborhood. So get out there, rake for our lakes, and we'll see you next month.